Alrighty. All right, guys, we are going to be recording our little Zoom today for notes to help you work through our introduction to heredity. You guys want to say hi to people at home? Hello. Who is you? You is everybody. Nobody's on right now. This is recording this for everybody who's at home. So all the 15 people at home can see or can hear. There's a lot of 8th graders in quarantine, so get better and quit getting quarantined. Jeez. Yeah. Because you may not test, you may still be carrying it, but you won't test positive for a few more days even. So you can be like contagious with it for up to 10 days. So if you have it, you'll test positive. But even if you test negative, you still have to quarantine. If somebody has it that like you live with, you are quarantined. So like if anybody in your family gets it, but if somebody in your family is just quarantined, you're not quarantined. No. If you get it though, your parents have to quarantine. Yeah. Okay. All right. Now that we've got on our little tangent here, yay! Here we go. So today we're going to be introducing the concept of heredity. And the reason we're doing this today is because there is a lot of new vocab that comes with genetics. And it is vocab that you have to have a solid handle on because I'm going to be using it. And it's very, very specific vocabulary. So we're going to introduce it today. And then tomorrow we're going to do a little bit of a review over it because I want you guys to know these terms and be comfortable with them before we start doing Punnett squares and genetic problems next week. All right? So, to kick us off, here is my question. I get to use my family as an example for this. So how is it that you can have siblings, one or multiple, who share the same genetic information because you have the same parents, but you can look either exactly like your siblings, a little bit like them, or nothing like them at all? Anna? Okay. You could inherit brown hair from your mom, but blue eyes from your dad. Okay. Your siblings can inherit black hair from your dad and brown eyes from your mom. Perfect. All right. So this is my little demonstration here. I have a deck of cards. All right. 52 cards in a deck. If I split that in half, it gives me 26 cards per half. I'm going to say that this stack is dad. This stack is mom. All right. Now, what happens if I shuffle my cards together? What am I making? A deck. And what does my deck of cards represent? A child. Okay. So say this deck of cards is me. All right. Now, my parents' genetics, just basic genetics. My dad had very, very dark brown hair when he was younger. He has blue eyes. My mom has brown hair and green eyes. I have 2 sisters. One, like me, has brown hair and green eyes. My youngest sister has very, very dark brown hair and very, very light blue eyes. Okay, so I just shuffled my parents together and made me. Now, if I shuffle, take my parents out again, okay, same genetic information, and I shuffle the cards again. Now, what happens with my deck of cards? I am not a good card shuffler. Okay. I have the same genetic information going into it, but what happens to my new individual? It's mixed. Is it mixed in a different way? Okay, but is it the same information going into it? Okay, so is it possible that you have siblings that look just like you? Yeah, okay. Several of you, I know your families, and I can look at you and I can say, I know exactly what family you belong to. Now, are there some of you that have siblings that you kind of look like, but not quite? Okay. Yes, you and Stuart do look similar. I would agree that yes, you are closer to Fiona. But there is a very close similarity between you and Stuart. Okay. Yes. Yeah. You look a lot. Yes. Yeah. You and Elena, not so much. Okay, so you and Elena is like myself and my youngest sister Krista. All right, my younger sister Krista looks a lot like my dad. My younger sister Shay and I look a lot like my mom. Okay, but Shay and I don't look a whole lot like Krista. Now, the same thing here works for my own kiddos. All right, my husband and I both have brown hair and green eyes. However, when I was little, I had very, very blonde hair. I have two kiddos, Kerrigan and Jasper, who are blonde hair and blue eyes. And then I have Alora, who is brown hair and green eyes. Now, Kerrigan and Jasper look very similar. When they were younger, they could almost be twins. They tend to look after my side of the family. Alora, as she gets older, is following a lot more after my husband's side of the family. Now, they have the same genetic information. Okay, 50% from my husband, 50% from me. But how is it that Alora looks so much like her dad, and Jasper and Kerrigan look like my side of the family? Okay, because the genes get split up differently. Okay, did Alora inherit different types of genes from my husband and myself? Yes. Okay, she did not inherit the blonde hair genes. She didn't inherit the blue hair gene, the blue eye genes. Kerrigan and Jasper did. All right. Alora inherited more of her face shape from her father's side of the family. All right. It's the same information, it's just how it gets divvied out. Who gets what type of these genes? So this whole idea of how you pass traits on from parents to offspring and to siblings and everything like that is called heredity. And we can't talk a lot about heredity without talking and going backwards a little bit to a man by the name of Gregor Mendel. So we're going to do a little bit of backtracking, a little bit of information about him as we get into this. So in your notes on page 15, okay, Gregor Mendel was an Austrian monk. He lived in a monastery. He had a lot of time on his hands. So he took up botany. And botany is the study of plants. And Mendel focused on pea plants. Now, could you guys imagine being able to devote 20 years of your life to studying pea plants? And how incredibly boring that must be. Okay? And he wrote journals upon journals, I mean, stacks and stacks of scientific journals and research on pea plants. But it's really important what he did because his study of pea plants solidified and created the concept of genetics. And it really hammered home the way we understand heredity, or passing traits from parent to offspring. So Gregor Mendel is often referred to as the father of genetics because of his contributions to the study of heredity through his pea plant experiments. Now, the way he did this is he started looking at pea plants, and he said, well, why do some have tall stems and some have short stems? Or why do some have purple flowers and some have white flowers? Why are some green and some are yellow? Why are some wrinkled and some are smooth? So what he did is he grew purebred plants. Now, when you hear the word purebred, what automatically pops in your head? Dogs, okay? What does it mean that if you have a purebred dog? It's the same breed all the way back, right? So if you have a purebred golden retriever, are there any other types of dog in that dog's pedigree? No, it's golden retriever the whole way back, right? If you have a purebred poodle, it's poodles all the way back. Those would be purebreds. Now, what happens if I mix that poodle with a golden retriever? It's a Labrador retriever. It's a, I don't know what you call them. Labradoodle. Yeah. That's a Labrador, not a golden retriever. Anyway, okay, we're gonna say it's a Labrador. We have Labradors all the way back. Purebred Labradors mixed with a poodle, so we get a Labradoodle. Could I make purebred Labradoodles? Yeah. How? You have to breed them together. Okay, I breed only Labradoodles together for generations, generations. Then I have a purebred line of Labradoodles. When I mix the first Labradoodles together, it's called a hybrid. Okay, so the first poodle plus Labrador is a hybrid. Otherwise, they were purebreds. So Mendel created purebred tall pea plants and purebred purple flower pea plants and purebred yellow peas and stuff like that. And then he started interbreeding them. So the first thing he did is he bred together a tall pea plant with a short pea plant. And normally, what do you think you'd get out of that? Medium-sized pea plants. Guess what? No, it didn't work out that way. What he got is he got a ratio of 3 tall pea plants to 1 short pea plant. So that, okay, what the bugger's going on here? We're getting there. Yes, the tall genes would be more dominant because it's showing up more often, right? Okay. So he thought, well, can I apply the same principle with the pea plant stems to pea plant flowers? So what he did is he took a purebred purple pea plant and he crossed it with a purebred white flower pea plant. And what did he get? Purple. Now, these ones are no longer hybrids because he crossed together a purple and a white. Sorry, these are no longer purebreds. These are hybrids now. He crossed a purebred purple with a purebred white to get hybrid purples. So, okay, that's an interesting outcome. What happened to the white flower? It poofed. So then he thought, okay, now what happens if I take and I cross 2 of these hybrid purple plants? So he did. And what shows back up? The white. Now, what happened to the white? What do you think, Shay? Okay, right. Around there. Okay, all right. Kira? It skipped a generation. All right. So was the information for the white plant in there the whole time? Yes. But what happened to it? It got masked by the purple because the purple is what we call more dominant, right? So it didn't disappear. It was there the whole time. It just takes the right situation for it to show back up again. So this idea of getting these traits to show up became the study of heredity. And heredity is the passing of physical traits. Now, why just physical? Why not personality or interests or talents or anything like that? Anna? Right. So what kind of traits would we call those? Acquired. All right. So we're talking about physical traits only because physical traits are inherited traits. I had a name like there. All right. We're only looking at traits that can be inherited, not acquired. So the passing of physical traits from a parent to their offspring. And when we're talking about mental, he's looking at traits like stem height and flower color. And he called all these characteristics about his pea plants their traits. Yesterday we looked at numerous types of inherited traits like your hairline shape, or can you not roll your tongue, or is your second toe or your first toe longer than the other, right? Those are all traits, excuse me, or physical characteristics that you could potentially pass on to offspring and that you inherited from your parents. Are you okay on this page? All right. So your genetic makeup, your specific genome, determines how your traits are inherited. Your parents' genomes determine how your traits are inherited, and your genome is going to control what traits you pass on to your offspring. And all of that is encoded on the genes that you inherit from your parents. So think about shuffling the card deck together. You randomly get genes from each parent. What order or what are you going to get that end up in your shuffled deck? So just a quick recap of the relationship with genes and DNA and how they inherit traits. All right? Your genes are sequences of DNA, which means that your DNA is made up of genes, 80,000 of them. And those genes and those pieces of DNA are passed from parent to offspring. We're going to hear that a lot repeated. Your inheritance is passed from parent to offspring. So the diagram that we have here is a very simplified version of the X and Y chromosome. The X is the big one, the Y is the smaller one, and each different colored section on there denotes a specific gene. Now this is oversimplified because there would be thousands of genes on each of these chromosomes. Or if we were to look at this diagram, which we've seen before, you have your strand of DNA right here, and as it gets tighter and tighter, coiled up, what does it condense down into? Chromosome, okay? Now, where would I find genes on this DNA strand? What's that? Okay, in the nitrogen bases, right? The order of the nitrogen bases and certain parts of the DNA, like the section right here, is a gene. So all of those genes strung together is what makes up your DNA. And then your DNA gets condensed down into one of your 46 chromosomes. Okay? And in humans, these genes include things like eye color and hair color and maybe your height, maybe your predisposition to get certain diseases. So as soon as you get these drag and drop into place, real quick, I want you to go on the left-hand side of your notes on the bottom left-hand corner. You see there's a box, and it says, what physical traits do you have? I want you guys to list 5 physical traits that you have in that box. So it could be anything up on here. It could be any of the ones we looked at yesterday in your trait tracker. But what are 5 examples of physical traits that you have? And then write those down in that box. All right, did everybody get 5 traits on there? You have 3? Okay. What ones that we did yesterday? Oh, that's wrong. All right, now this is where I'm going to start throwing vocab words at you. The first one we're going to look at is something called an allele, right? And an allele is simply a version of a gene, okay, or a different version of a gene. The way this works is you inherit 2 copies of each gene, one from dad, one from mom. We would call each of those copies of a gene the allele, all right? So you inherit 2 alleles for each trait. You get 1 allele from dad, 1 allele from mom, for every single one of your 80,000 genes. You'll inherit 2 alleles. 1 allele comes from dad, 1 allele comes from mom. Now this is where we get to ones you've heard before. The 2 types of alleles are those that are dominant, like we said the purple pea flower was, and the tall pea plant. And what's the other one? Recessive, okay? So for example, yesterday we looked at tongue rolling as an inherited trait. Who in here can roll your tongue? You can talk over your tongue. Yeah. Okay. Now, who in here cannot roll their tongue? Okay. Can't roll your tongue. All right. So Jersey and I can tell right off the bat we have the recessive version of this because being able to roll your tongue is a dominant trait, which means that every single one of you in here who can roll your tongue has at least one dominant allele. Maybe you get two, so maybe you have a dominant and a dominant for dad, dominant for mom. Maybe you have a dominant and a recessive. Okay? Yeah. That's an inherited trait. You either can do it or you can't do it. Jersey and I inherited recessive traits, recessive alleles for it, because we can't do it. So I know my parents, who can both roll their tongue, have to have at least one dominant, and they have to have a dominant and a recessive allele because I have two recessive alleles. Which means I got a recessive one from dad, I got a recessive one from mom. But because they both have one dominant allele, guess what they can do? They can roll their tongues. Okay, yes? No, I can't. That is not a skill I inherited, yes.
So what if you have one parent that
Then you could either do it or maybe not, depending on if you inherited the one dominant allele. How can I what? Just can't. My tongue doesn't do it. I could sit here and stick my tongue at you all day, and it would never roll. My husband said, just do it. Just do it. Stick it out and do it. No, I can't do it. Okay. So when we're looking at a dominant versus a recessive allele, and when we start doing genetic problems next week, we're going to be representing each of these by a letter. All right? A dominant allele in your genetic problems is always going to be represented by a capital letter. Okay? So up here we have a capital E and a capital E. Each of those would be a dominant allele. This one has a lowercase f and a capital F. So the lowercase f would be recessive. The uppercase F would be dominant. All right? So real quick, if you guys would go down to slide, I don't know what number it is right now. Slide 18. Okay, I gotta turn my screen share back on. So on page 18, what we're gonna do is we're gonna label each of these alleles on the chromosomes as dominant or recessive based on if they're capital or lowercase. So our first one, this pink E, is gonna be what? Is it dominant or recessive? It's dominant, okay? What about my F? Dominant. Okay, my little d here, recessive. Okay, what about the A? A is dominant. Okay, what about the H? Okay, H is recessive. And the R is dominant. Now what about our second chromosome on here? Our E is what? It's dominant. Our F is recessive. The D is recessive. What about the A? Okay, the A is recessive, that's lowercase a. What about the H? Dominant, and the last one, we don't have a choice, it has to be dominant. All right, so anytime we look at a genetics problem and we're talking about the alleles, the dominant allele will always be represented by a capital letter. Recessive alleles will always be represented by a lowercase letter. Yes, go back to the notes page. So moving on back to your notes page, back on page number 17 now. Everybody got this part filled in, right? Part about the alleles on page 17? Okay. Right. Yeah. Okay. So a little bit of information about dominant versus recessive alleles. Okay. If you have a dominant allele, that trait that you inherited is always going to be expressed. Okay. All right. So if you inherit one version of the allele, one dominant allele, or if you inherit two dominant alleles, guess what? It's always going to be expressed. So every one of you in here who can roll your tongues, you have at least one dominant allele because it only takes one for it to be expressed. We represent it using capital letters like we just did on our drag and drop. A recessive allele means that the trait has to be inherited and the trait is only expressed if two alleles are inherited. You have to have two recessive alleles for that trait to be expressed. One doesn't work. You have to have two, which means you have to inherit a recessive allele from both parents. So with my not being able to roll my tongue, I know my parents both have a recessive allele somewhere in there because I got both of them. And we represent a recessive allele using lowercase letters. So dominant alleles are always expressed, even if there's one or two of them. Recessive alleles are only expressed if there are two of them that have been inherited. So now we're going to go back into your notebook page. And for some people, it works a little bit easier if they can give these genotypes a personality trait. So what we're going to do on page number 19 is we're going to label each of these. So the first one we're going to look at says only one to be seen. Does that fit a dominant or a recessive allele? Dominant, okay? A dominant trait only needs one allele for it to be expressed. Now what about two to be seen? What does that fit? Recessive, okay? You have to inherit two recessive alleles for that trait to be expressed. Now let's look at our little personality traits here. Which one would you describe as shy, dominant or recessive? Recessive, yep. What about bossy? Dominant, okay? Dominant is bossy because it always wants to be expressed. It's going to show up, it's going to power its way through there. And then our last one is reserved, recessive, okay? So now we have these two combinations, or these three combinations of letters. Our first one here has a capital R and a lowercase r. So in this one, is the dominant trait going to be expressed or the recessive trait? The dominant. Why the dominant? Because there's one capital. If there's one, it's going to be expressed. It doesn't matter. Now, how about if I have two capital R's? Where does that go? That also goes into dominant. Which means that our last one here, our lowercase r gets to be recessive. All right. Now for this next one, I'm just going to stay here in the notes on page 17. And we're going to introduce two more vocab terms. Well, a few more. The first one we're going to focus on is a genotype. Excuse me. So a genotype is an organism's genetic makeup. So this one I always remember with GEN because both of them start with GEN. So a genotype is the genetics of that individual. And we're going to divide the entire idea of a genotype into 3 types. So we've had dominant and recessive alleles. Now we're going to assign those alleles to a genotype. And this is where our vocab starts to take off. So the 3 genotypes, the first one we have is something that's called homozygous dominant. So we're going to find the homozygous over here and drag it over to dominant. And if we look at the way this word is built, homo, oops, I don't want to do that, is Latin for same. And zygous means combination of traits. So a genotype that is homozygous dominant is going to have 2 dominant alleles. So down here you can see we've got capital B, capital B, capital G, capital G, capital R, capital R. Notice how all of those letters, we've got 2 capitals, 2 capitals, 2 capitals. 2 dominant, 2 dominant, 2 dominant, right? Homozygous meaning same, dominant, both of them are going to be dominant or capital. There's another type of homozygous, and that is homozygous recessive. So again, homo means same, zygous, combination of traits. But if it's recessive, what does that mean? What's that? Right, I have 2 recessives, okay? So I'm gonna have 2 lowercase letters. So you can see down here I have little a, little t, little r, little r. Those are all examples of a homozygous recessive genotype. So this would be mine for rolling tongues, okay? Homozygous recessive. Now the other one we have is something called heterozygous. And hetero means different. So in a heterozygous genotype, you're going to have 1 dominant allele and 1 recessive allele. So if you look at it, we have different letter cases. We have a capital and a lowercase, a capital and a lowercase, a capital and a lowercase. So everyone else in here for your genotypes for rolling your tongue, you would have either a homozygous dominant or a heterozygous. I know my parents are heterozygous because they have to have a dominant one for being able to roll their tongues, and they have to have a recessive one that I could inherit because I got one from both parents. So let's look at this in a labeling standpoint, down on page number 20. So here we have a person's genotype, and you notice how everything is lined up letter to letter to letter. So our first one here, we have a dominant, denoted by a capital letter, and we have a recessive, denoted by a lowercase letter. Which genotype should we assign to that first one up there? That was just an H and E? Hetero. Okay, hetero, because you notice there's a capital and a lowercase. They're both different sizes, okay? So different size letters, hetero, 1 dominant, 1 recessive. What about the next one? We have a recessive and a dominant, a lowercase and a capital. That one is also heterozygous. Our next one, we have 2 recessive alleles, little h, little h. Homozygous, recessive, yes. Yep. So when we do homozygous, we have to denote whether it's recessive or dominant because they're both homozygous. We gotta know which form it is. How about dominant here and a dominant here? Homozygous dominant, yes. And then we have a recessive and a recessive. So this one would be what? Homozygous recessive. And we have one left. So our last one has a dominant and a dominant, meaning that it gets to be homozygous dominant. All right. And our last little bit in here, the last vocab word I'm going to throw at you today is something called a phenotype. So if a genotype is an organism's genetic makeup, a phenotype, we're just going to drag and drop here, a phenotype on page 21. 1 second. A phenotype is an organism's physical appearance based on their genotype. Okay? And again, like I did with genotype and genetics, I come in here and I do pheno, pH, and physical, pH. So a phenotype is an organism's physical appearance. Yes. Yes. It just does. Your pinky's a finger, it has a different name too. It's a finger. It's a phalange. Phalanges. They're all phalanges. Okay. Ring finger. Yeah. Okay. So examples of a phenotype that you would be able to see. So you can see a person's phenotype, but you can't see their genotype. All right. I don't know what your genetic information is just by looking at you. Sometimes I can figure it out though. Okay, I'm going to show you a trick. The gene for polydactyly, and polydactyly means having 6 fingers on your hand, is dominant. It's dominant. How many of you in here have 6 fingers on either of your hands? You all have 5 fingers on your hands, right? Okay, guess what? You all have recessive genes in here. Because having 6 fingers on one hand is a dominant trait. So the tongue rolling, yeah, you guys are all either dominant recessive or dominant dominant. But you'll have at least one dominant. Okay? I can guarantee you that everybody in this school, Ethan, everybody in this school is recessive for polydactyly. Means they don't have 6 fingers. They all have 5 fingers. Okay? So examples of phenotypes would be like in pea plants, it's tall, or it has purple flowers, or it has yellow peas. In humans, it's blue eyes, or brown hair, or 6 fingers, or if you have A positive blood type. Okay? Those are all phenotypes. It's the way that the genotype expresses itself. So our last little bit here is, let's look over at the right-hand side. And it says, if brown eyes, capital B, is dominant over blue eyes, lowercase b, what are possible genotypes and phenotypes for each? So we're going to look at our word bank over here on the left. And let's look at our genotypes here. So our homozygous dominant, homozygous recessive, and heterozygous. Which one of these belongs over here under brown eye genotype? If capital B is dominant over lowercase b. Okay, 2 capital B's, yes. So homozygous dominant gets to come over here because it has how many capital B's? 2. It has 2 dominant, which means that it's going to be expressed. Is there another one we can put over here? Which one? Okay, capital B, lowercase b, or our heterozygous, because it has at least 1 dominant there. So both our homozygous dominant and our heterozygous genotypes are going to code for what type of phenotype. What color eyes is this person going to have? Brown. Okay, I'm going to drive brown over here. Yes. Okay, and then what would our genotype or our genetic information for blue eyes be? Okay, lowercase, our homozygous recessive is going to go under our genotype. And because blue eyes is recessive to brown eyes, you have to have 2 copies of that in order to get blue eyes, which means that the phenotype is now going to be blue. Yes? So technically, yes, brown eyes are dominant to blue eyes, but because human eye color is controlled by about 7 different genes, it's really hard to go in here and say it's blue eyes, brown eyes, green eyes. Okay, we can't do that. This is a very, very oversimplified version of this. To say that brown eyes is dominant over blue eyes, yes, it's true. Yes. Yep. Yes. Mm-hmm. It just, so it's a combination of 7 different genes. So there's this huge spectrum that eye colors can fit into. Maybe he's going to get to these pictures finally. Very, very dark brown eyes, not black though. Maybe not. Anyway, if we look at the wide variety of, so we've got green up here, and then it goes down into blue, and then down into brown, but there's shades of everything in there. So you can have greenish brown, greenish blue, bluish green, greenish, everything like that. Okay? Yes, everything like that. So if you've ever noticed, nobody has ever just brown eyes or just green eyes or just blue eyes. There's a spectrum that it falls into. It's usually the way the light hits it. So the way that the coloring in there, it kind of morphs with the lighting. So, okay. All right, for you at home, we are finished. I'm signing off now. Check back. To everybody, bye.